So certainly contacting your local councillors is a good idea, I guess. And local councillors as constituents is a really sensible place to start, because obviously they represent you. What I would say for an issue like this, because it is obviously much more about the council taking a position, which is more for, it's more of like an area-wide position, you might want to consider looking at the group leaders rather than your local councillors in particular, because what's likely to happen as a result of this, and we'll come on to this later, is that it's more likely to be something like a full council motion that you're looking at, which is because it's obviously a much more political statement, essentially, is what we're looking for with this. So it might be more appropriate to actually divide and conquer by party or by party leader, because your individual local councillors might be excellent local councillors, but they might not necessarily be the people to speak to about climate and environment issues. I mean, they might be able to point you in the right direction. It might be a case of kind of doing both at once. But I think it's probably worth flagging that they are your kind of point of contact, but you are also able to contact other people. So if you can identify other councillors because of their party affiliation, or because you've seen them at particular events, or you've heard them speak on particular issues that are relevant, like, you are allowed to kind of contact them. And I think, I get contacts as the climate spokesperson for the Greens from right across the city. And obviously, if I get somebody who's from outside my ward contacting me, I will speak to the ward colleague just to kind of make them aware. But there's nothing, provided you're not asking them to do a specific piece of casework, which you're not in this instance, because this is obviously a campaigning tool that we're talking about here. You're perfectly allowed to contact them as a politician, I guess, so to speak. So it's certainly, I don't think it's not a bad idea to contact your local councillor, especially if you know them and you kind of get a sense of where they'll be on this issue. But I would say as well, don't be afraid of kind of going out with your ward, because wards can be quite small, and you might not necessarily have somebody sympathetic there. In terms of writing to all of your councillors as well, I think we'll get into this in terms of the first steps and actually how to get action on an issue. I think it might be that there are some sort of preliminary steps before you're almost getting to the point of writing to them to ask for help. So things like trying to get an understanding of what the council is already doing on an issue. So has your council declared a climate emergency already? Has your council declared a nature emergency? Has your council done anything on sustainable procurement, or all kinds of issues that might be related to the treaty or whatever it is? And it might be better off starting in that kind of researchy space, so then you've actually got something to go to a local councillor about. But at the same time, you might do those two things in tandem. I think there's probably no exactly right answer. And I think the thing to say is that, yes, local councillors is a good place to start, but also don't limit yourself, because you don't need to, if that makes sense. You can take something that is more political to a political group. I will be very honest, and I think there's a huge amount that council, I suppose I can only speak of my experience of Edinburgh, and I think that whilst there is a lot of good work going on in terms of making public, what the council has done and what the council has decided, council websites are not the easiest to navigate, and until you know how to hop between the committees and the minutes and all of the reports and documents, it can be quite difficult. I would suggest literally just putting into a Google search Glasgow Council climate emergency, and you will probably find something, and it will probably take you to a council webpage which will say what the council is doing on climate. Or I would hope that all local authorities at least have a website that makes it easy enough to find this information, because there are duties on the council in terms of its reporting to the Scottish Government for its public bodies climate change duties. So each local authority has to publish a report and send it to the Scottish Government to say, hey, this is what we're doing on climate. So these are publicly available documents. They will be buried possibly in sort of committee web pages and things like that. But if you Google public bodies climate change duties report, Glasgow City Council 2020, 3 or whatever, 2022, you would hope that it would come up, or that is the sort of thing where you could ask, that is the sort of question you could ask a local councillor as well, is, where is the page on climate, or have you declared a climate emergency, or have you, what have you done on this space already? But again, it might be that uh, contacting the political groups rather than just the ward councillors will give you a better result. So the way that we organise, and it's quite common to organise as political groups, is that we have spokespeople on individual issues. So within my ward, I guess everybody in Morningside ward who gets in contact with their Green councillor gets quite lucky, because I am a climate and environment spokesperson. So if they ask me about a climate issue, I've probably got the answer anyway, because I've got the answer for the group, because I'm the one that's doing it. They're possibly unlucky because if they come and ask me about an education issue, it takes me a little bit longer because I have to go to, we're aware, everybody should be aware of everything, but in terms of that, like hyper specific detail, it can be harder, which is why I think almost the political groups is maybe slightly easier for you at this stage, because it would mean that your query would go to the right person, I guess, sooner, because it would be clear that it was, not a hyper local issue that you're actually interested in, but it's the citywide stuff. And that would include asking questions like, have you declared a climate emergency or not? I think you've got questions later about officers, which I think are relevant for this as well. So maybe we'll come to that when we get there, because it's not, the council is not just the councillors. There's lots of other people doing lots of very important work. So there are ways to kind of engage with them too. So. Well, maybe I'll tell you about the Edinburgh process. So in Edinburgh, the Green Group got lobbied, if you want to call it that, lobbied to bring something on the Fossil Fuel Treaty. Had an internal discussion, decided that yes, obviously, has the Green has Green councillors. That's something that we certainly support. And then we wrote a full council motion, which basically said, let's sign the Fossil Fuel Treaty. Let's not mess around. And then what happened is at full council, we had an amendment that came from, at the time, it was the administration, which was the Labour group and the SNP group in coalition. And they brought an amendment that said, thank you very much for your motion. We agree that this is something we should look at, but let's not just sign up to it. Let's get a report to our Policy and Sustainability Committee, which is the committee that looks after climate and environment in Edinburgh. Each council will have slightly different structure. But they said, no, we don't want to just sign up to it. What we want is officers to write us a lovely little report that'll say, this would be what the impact would be of us signing up to the treaty. And then what happened in, I think it was 6 months later, or however long it took for officers to go away and do that piece of work, the report came forward to that committee. And then at that committee, because the way that local councils tend to work is lots of things, you might have a motion where you ask for a report for officers to go away and do the work to sort of say, well, this is what the actual impact would be, or this is how this might work, or this is what the budgetary implication will be. And then it comes to a committee, or well, it's often a committee for the kind of rubber stamping, and the reports come with recommendations on the front page. So sometimes those recommendations just say things like, note the report, which just means, okay, we did that report for you. We're not going to do anything else. Sometimes they say things like, note the report and agree to, employ 3 staff to look after whatever, and agree to endorse the Fossil Fuel Treaty. So what happened is, in Edinburgh, we kind of had that motion at full council that got amended to say, no, we want a report at Policy and Sustainability Committee instead. So we got a report at Policy and Sustainability Committee where the recommendations of that report just said, note the content of this report, which was what officers were saying. So they didn't offer a particular recommendation. But then we amended the report recommendations at the committee to say, note the report's content and therefore agrees to sign up to the treaty. So it's a bit of a long-winded process. Some of that I think is cultural. So in Edinburgh, it feels like we have a real and culture of sort of things taking a long time and it being about you sort of make a statement and then actually really the action is you get the report which has got a bit more detail in it, and then you hear that in almost like a second hearing at committee, and then you agree the recommendations if you're lucky. And if you're not lucky, your report gets amended for another report or another consideration or whatever, and then you go on like that ad infinitum. I suspect that in Edinburgh it's like that because we've got a very contested political makeup within the council. So we've got 9 Conservatives, 10 Green councillors, 12 from Labour, 13 Liberal Democrats, and 17 SNP. So the numbers are very tight in the sense that every single vote is kind of like we don't know what's going to happen. In some councils, I guess, if you've got a majority, I don't know because I don't have experience of this, but I suspect if you've got a majority, things like just getting it signed and passed, might be a little bit easier in that kind of interim stage of we'll have a report and then we'll decide to endorse it might not happen. The other thing that I would say on that, and then I will be quiet because I've been talking for a long time, is that because Edinburgh has kind of done that work, it might prove quite useful for other groups, or for other councillors in other parts of Scotland, because the reason why it's always difficult being the first, right? Because the first is scary and nobody quite knows what it means or what that would look like. But the fact that this has already happened, and the fact that there is a public report available, and I'll make sure that we send the links through to Jane so that she can circulate them. It gives you something to point to, and actually as a campaign tool for you guys as well, to be able to approach local councillors and say, this is what we want, and this is how it happened in Edinburgh, and here's a load of information that council officers in Edinburgh came up with to show that it's perfectly possible and actually quite a good idea. There it all is on a plate for you. You might also have a slightly easier time of it. We've had other examples of things that we've signed. So in Edinburgh, we signed up to the plant-based treaty as well, and we had a very similar process where we had a motion at full council that said, let's sign up to the plant-based treaty. And then we had an amendment that said, no, let's not sign up to it yet. Let's get a report and then decide. And then we had the report come back, and then we amended the report to say, great, thank you for the report. Now let's sign up to it. And then the next thing that we've got coming as a result of that is actually an action plan to implement the report recommendations, which is coming back to the next committee. So yeah, sometimes you can get lost in the multiple steps. And I guess, like I say, in Edinburgh, I think we have a lot of that. In other councils, you might see that less because of the political makeup. Like I say, it might make it slightly less contested. On each council website, so for an Edinburgh, for example, there's a page when you go on the City of Edinburgh Council website. On the front page, there's a load of buttons which talk about council tax, bins and recycling, roads, planning and building, all the things that the council delivers as services. But there's also a button that just says council and committees. I think it used to say democracy, actually. And if you go into that, that's like the section of the council website which will have a list, which has a list of all of your local councillors. And I suspect it probably looks slightly different for each local authority, but in Edinburgh, for example, there is a find your councillor button, which will give you a long list of all of the councillors with a nice little picture of them. But you can also search by political party, you can search alphabetically, you can search by ward as well. So that's probably where you find the list, is just on the council website. And I suspect if you type in Stirling Council, my councillors, it'll be the first result that comes up, and you'll certainly find yourself in roughly the right part of the council website. So in Edinburgh, everything is hosted on I think it's something like democracy.edinburgh.ac.uk as opposed to edinburgh.gov.uk or whatever it is, which is where you find all of the actual council services stuff. So there will be a special section of the website. You might have to dig a little bit, and if you can't find it at all, that's definitely something you should contact your local councillor about, because that's a very easy piece of casework for them to pick up, because they should be able to reply to your email to say, here's the list, and here's the link that you're looking for. But yeah, I mean, and so that will give you kind of the list of councillors. What it should also give you is like a a page on like the committee structure. So, like I say, all councils will have a slightly different structure because um, it's kind of all made up. I mean, it's sensible, but there's no real requirement. There's no requirement, for example, for you to have a. So in Edinburgh, we've got housing, homelessness, and fair work because we put housing, homelessness, and fair work together in a committee. We don't have to do that. Some local authorities have homelessness in with health and social care. They have housing separately, and they have an economy committee. You know, in Edinburgh, we have transport and environment, which is a real messy one anyway, in my view. Other local authorities will have transport, and they will have a climate and environment committee. In Edinburgh, we don't have a climate committee at all. We don't have a net zero committee. They're quite common in other local authorities. That's because we have a like senior executive committee, which is that policy and sustainability committee that I was talking about. And that's where all of the like cross-cutting issues are supposed to sit. And because we say that climate change is well, in our view, it's the biggest thing that we should be talking about because it's, you know, through which everything else should be framed. We've kind of argued to get climate put into that policy and sustainability committee, and that's also the committee where all of the group leaders sit on as well. So there should be a section on the website where you should be able to quite clearly see what the different committees are, and then when you click on them, you should also be able to see who sits on those committees. There should also be contact information for council officers that look after those committees. So these are people that will work in democracy services, if that makes sense. So council is full of lots of different people doing lots of different things. You've got council officers that are parking attendants, or you know, people who work in parks and green space, or housing officers, you know, people who do real jobs, you know. But there should also be a team within the council that looks after democracy. And again, that will look different in different councils as well. But these are the people who are like the convener support officers or committee support officers, the committee clerks. In Edinburgh, we've got, I think the job title is head of governance, which is, or head of democracy and governance, which I think is an excellent job title to have, you know, and you should be able to see who that is on the council website. So if you're kind of in the weeds of, well, actually, where would climate change even sit within the council? If we're not aiming for full council, so every council will have a full council because you just sort of have to, because you have to have a space where all councillors can come together. But if you're trying to work out, well, actually, is there a different committee that this is better for? There should be contact details within those committee pages of the officers. And obviously the officers are apolitical. So if you are concerned citizen A wanting to know about how the council runs, there should be a council officer who's able to explain that to you. There's a whole load of, like in Edinburgh, when you really get into the weeds on the pages, there's a whole load of like governance documents that are publicly available too. And these have things like the council standing orders and processes. They have things like the like remits for each committee, which are kind of boring, but also they're like very important because they're, you know, they're the things that the council has decided to, like how the council has decided to govern itself, and that's all tied up in the standing orders too. So I don't think you need to worry too much about going into that level of detail, because it will probably be quite clear to you that when you click on it and it says that they've got a net zero committee, that actually chatting about climate change, you know, might be a good place to do that. And within each committee too, sorry, I should say, you'll also have, you'll certainly have a committee convener. You might well have a vice convener as well. So again, on that subject of, well, am I contacting my local representative, or am I thinking of myself as a campaign group working on a political issue? Well, actually, if there is a net zero committee and there is a convener of that committee, they're probably a good person to speak to, regardless of whether you live in their ward or not. And I think, provided you're framing yourself as, we're getting in touch from Global Justice Now, that's entirely appropriate. You know, if you're just some random person, you know, that's slightly more difficult. So it's worth getting into. If you can find that part of the website, and it should be easy enough to find, that will probably give you a clue of the different people. And then there's probably a task as well of cross-referencing, well, actually, let me just Google that person as well and see see what they're putting out on Twitter, see what they're putting out on Facebook, see if they've got a page on a party political website, whatever. And some of these people, hopefully, you'll know anyway, because you should hopefully all know who your local councillors are, because that's what democracy, if democracy is functioning, then you should know. But that certainly is the place to look. Again, sorry, that was a lot of words, wasn't it? Exactly. And I would say, don't, like, councillors are just people, like, it's cool if you send us an email. like
Yeah.
we'll probably reply, and some people might not reply, and that might also just be because we get thousands of emails every single day, and not much support to get through them all. But you know i would I would encourage you just to reach out as well, and kind of say, hey, we're Global Justice Now, do you know about us, and we'd like to talk to you about the fossil fuel treaty, and then just kind of see where you go. But I mean, already on the call, we've sort of all inadvertently said that the party politics thing does play a role here, and I would say that, yeah, contact a Green councillor, because we will respond positively and be able to give you a sense of, well, actually what the reality is on the ground. Because there are also, and I can think of examples in my own council of people from political parties where you might think that the political party is not especially strong on an issue, but actually the individual councillors clearly have a particular interest in that. And so despite their party affiliation, despite their party background, they might actually be interested in something. So I would also say, don't discount people on the basis of their political group, but at the same time, yeah, maybe do give yourself half a chance by looking at the person that's convening the stuff to do with climate change anyway, and thinking about, yeah, party background and kind of generic party policies, and things like the manifestos and stuff that would have been released at the last local election. So in Scotland, that would have been in 2022. They will give you a sense of kind of where people are at. If they've got a big long section on climate, then that's probably a good thing. If they've got not very much on climate, then maybe that's less of a good thing. So there's an element of political savvy, I guess, in there as well. So in terms of building momentum, I think once if you've identified someone that's going to bring emotion, that's when I think you can really crank it up in terms of getting emails to all councillors out, and that's when you get your local group to, I was going to say spam. We don't mean spam, but you get a bit of an e-action going, and you make sure that all councillors have got emails from people asking them to endorse it. In terms of on the day, most councils, well, I think all councils actually, I think it is a requirement, have what they call like a deputation process. So that's where you can either again, it will look slightly different for different councils, I'm sure, but in Edinburgh, you can either submit a written deputation, or you can come and address the council in person. So in Edinburgh, what that looks like is you get 10 minutes at the beginning of a council meeting. The Lord Provost says, welcome, this is Fiona from Global Justice Now. And then Fiona comes in, she stands up at the front and she says, please support this motion. And then councillors ask a couple of questions, and then Fiona goes home. And the idea is that obviously councillors are supposed to consider what's been said. And I think there are pros and cons of the deputation process we have in Edinburgh, but certainly it is absolutely a tool that should be used, and every council should have it, because the motions that have got deputations on, they force councillors to think about it, because I'll be honest, there will be some local councillors who won't, if you're not interested, or if you're not paying attention, or if you're very busy, or whatever it is, and this isn't your bag, you might not you might not engage with it, but it kind of forces that engagement and obviously makes the case much stronger. So it is worth thinking about planning when you want the motion to be brought as well, and working with the elected representative that's kind of championing it for you, because the last thing you want to do is for them to decide that they'll put it in at the next full council meeting when all of your local group are away and nobody can turn up and speak to it, because that's a missed opportunity. So do make sure you plan that. And the same with the emails too. So, the last thing you want is somebody to get really, really enthusiastic and then kind of put in the motion before you've had chance as a local group to kind of get your ducks in order. But at the same time, you don't want to be holding up action if somebody's interested in it. So, there probably is a balancing act. So most councils will have a petitions process where you can try and get something on the agenda. Um, what I would say is those people that I was talking about earlier who work in democracy, if that makes sense, if you go through the council's committee pages, they will be able to tell you about that. And those pages should also, again, if everything works as it should, it should also be very clear to you how that process would work. In Edinburgh, we've actually had a bit of a say a funny relationship with a petitions protest process over the years, let's say. But the other thing that I would say that you could do is if you are struggling to get somebody to bring a motion on it initially, you could bring a deputation on a related subject where you talk about the fossil fuel treaty. And then it's, so say there's a report that's coming about climate change or procurement or divestment or something that you've seen and that you can see is happening already, you could come and give a deputation about that and then talk about the fossil fuel treaty within your deputation and then sort of make the offer. Because the other thing is that, because all of this happens in public, so if as part of your deputation you also say something like, and will the council leader agree to meet with me? The council leader is probably going to find it very difficult to say no, because it's all in public, right? And you don't look bad because you're asking for something good. So, if you're really struggling, that's probably also a route. That's quite nuclear in a way, in that it's quite like, left field. But if you really can't get anywhere, that at least gets you in front of the council. It gets you stood there as a group talking about an issue that you can't. Obviously, it needs to be a little bit related. Don't try and don't start talking about it on a subject that's totally unrelated. You just won't be taken seriously. But you can put yourself in front of the council in that way, and it is worth thinking about that, because if you can just get your foot in the door, maybe it means you have to play a slightly longer game, but it's not a bad thing to consider, I would say.